Boise County, Idaho, Thanksgiving night. A woman is driving into the dark, leaving behind a house full of people who just cheered for her exile. My name is Charlie Rivers, and while my father slams his hand on the table demanding respect, he has no idea that I am the only one in the room who can afford to save him. The air in the car is thick with the memory of humiliation, but under the leather seat lies a secret that changes everything. They believe I am a failure to be pitied. They are about to learn that I am the landlord of their debt, and the lease is up. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The sound of my father's hand slamming against the solid oak dining table cracked through the room like a gunshot, instantly silencing the clatter of silverware and the hum of polite conversation. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the scent of roasted turkey sage stuffing, and the stale, overheating air of a house packed too full of people who pretended to love each other. 20 heads turned toward the head of the table. My mother frozen mid-sip of her iced tea, my brother Aaron leaning back with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, and the visiting pastor's wife looking down at her plate, as if suddenly fascinated by the green bean casserole. But my father, Mark Rivers, wasn't looking at them. He was staring directly at me, his face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson that clashed with the pristine white collar of his Sunday best shirt. "You're almost 30, Charlotte." He spat, his voice low and vibrating with a rage that seemed entirely disproportionate to whatever minor offense I had committed by simply existing at this table. "You are almost 30 years old, and you are still chasing that stupid online nonsense. I am sick of it. If you're so independent, if you think you're too good for the way we do things in this house, then go live in the truck stop with the rest of the drifters, because that's where you're headed." Humiliation burned under my skin, hot and prickling, traveling up my neck to my cheeks. It wasn't just the words, it was the audience. We were surrounded by the pillars of our small Boise County community, deacons, neighbors, people who had known me since I was in pigtails. The walls of the dining room were practically a shrine to the Rivers family brand of respectability. Framed American flags from Grandpa's service hung next to photos of church potlucks, and a wall of sports trophies that mostly belonged to Aaron. Everything in this room screamed hard work, traditional values, and God-fearing success. And here I was, the stain on the tablecloth. I gripped the edge of my chair, my knuckles turning white. The irony of the moment was so sharp it almost made me laugh, though I knew if I did it would look like hysteria. My father was lecturing me about financial responsibility and the grim future of poverty awaiting me, completely unaware that I was the only person sitting at this table, including him, who could write a check for this entire property, the 3 cars in the driveway, and his struggling construction business without breaking a sweat. But they didn't know that. To them, I was Charlie the dreamer, the failure, the girl staring at a laptop screen while the real world passed her by. "Mark, honey." My mother. Linda sighed, her voice dripping with that practiced wounded martyr tone she had perfected over decades. She reached out and patted his arm, performing the role of the peacemaker while twisting the knife. "Don't raise your blood pressure. We tried, didn't we? We tried to raise her right. We gave her every opportunity to follow the path. Look at Aaron." She gestured to my brother as if unveiling a statue. "Aaron followed the real American path. Steady job, service to the community, a pension. He's building a life." Aaron took a swig of his beer, basking in the praise. He was the local hero, a firefighter and paramedic who could do no wrong. "Hey, at least my job saves lives, right?" He joked loudly, looking around the table to ensure he had everyone's attention. "I don't even understand what Charlie does. What is it this week, Char? Some pyramid scheme selling vitamins to lonely housewives? Or is it crypto scams?" A ripple of laughter went through the room. Even Paige, his fiancée, giggled into her napkin, her perfectly manicured hand hiding a smile that wasn't kind. No one defended me. Not my aunt, not the neighbors I'd tutored in high school. The narrative was set: Aaron was the golden anchor of the family, and I was the driftwood. Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, leaned forward, her pearls clicking against the table. Her eyes were wide with faux concern. "Have you thought about coming back home, sweetie? Getting a real job in town? The diner is hiring, and I know Mark could probably pull some strings at the plant. Maybe the Lord is telling you this online thing just isn't working. There's no shame in admitting defeat. I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the smug satisfaction on my father's face, the pity in the eyes of the guests, the arrogance radiating off my brother. They loved this. They loved having someone to look down on because it made their own mediocre, debt-ridden lives feel successful by comparison. "I'm not asking for a job," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "And I'm not asking for money." "But you will," Mark interrupted, slamming his hand down again, though with less force this time, more of a final gavel strike. "That's the point. We're done bailing you out. No more handouts, no more pity. You wanted to be on your own, fine. You're not welcome under this roof until you grow up and respect this family." He jerked his thumb toward the front door, past the foyer filled with family photos that I was notably absent from. "You want to be a stray? Go live in the truck stop. Get out." The air left the room. This was it. The official exile. For a second, a dangerous impulse flared in my chest. I wanted to pull up my banking app. I wanted to show them the seven-figure balance, the passive income streams, the agency I'd built from nothing that generated more in a month than Aaron made in 5 years. I wanted to scream that I hadn't asked them for a dime since I was 18. But I looked at my mother's pinched, judgmental face, and I realized it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't believe me, or worse, they'd try to take credit for it. They weren't interested in the truth. They were addicted to their superiority. I stood up, pushing my chair back. The scrape of wood against the floor was the only sound in the house. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just looked my father in the eye. "If that's how you feel," I said, my voice eerily calm, "I won't stand in your way." I walked out of the dining room, grabbing my coat from the rack. I could hear the muttering starting up behind me, words like dramatic, ungrateful, and selfish floating through the hallway. I stepped out into the biting Idaho cold, the wind instantly numbing my flushed cheeks. I walked to my rental car, not the beater they assumed I drove, but a modest sedan I kept just for visits to avoid suspicion. As I turned the ignition and pulled away from the house that had never really been a home, watching the warm glow of the windows fade in the rearview mirror, a dark, cold realization settled over me. Mark had told me to go live in the streets. He thought he was cutting off a leash. What neither he nor my mother nor my golden boy brother knew was that the ground they were standing on wasn't as solid as they thought. They told me to leave. What they didn't know was they were already living on something that belonged to me. To understand why I walked away from that table without shedding a tear, you have to understand the house I grew up in. It wasn't a home, it was a theater, and my brother Aaron was the star of the show. I was just a stagehand expected to stay out of the light and sweep up the confetti after his parades. From the time we were kids, the lines were drawn in permanent marker. Aaron was the all-American son my father had prayed for. He was broad-shouldered, loud, and good at throwing a ball. By high school, his name was in the local paper every Friday morning during football season. My father, Mark, would cut those clippings out with the precision of a surgeon and tape them to the refrigerator until the appliance looked less like a place to store food and more like a shrine to varsity athletics. Mark would stand back, hands on his hips, beaming as he told anyone who would listen that Aaron was the kind of man this country needs. I, on the other hand, was the ghost in the machine. While Aaron was out on the field soaking up the floodlights, I was hidden away in the school computer lab, bathed in the blue glow of a CRT monitor. I wasn't athletic, I wasn't loud, and I certainly wasn't a boy. I was obsessed with the logic of code, the way you could build an entire world from nothing if you just knew the right syntax. It was clean, it made sense. Unlike my family, if you made a mistake in code, the computer didn't guilt-trip you. It just gave you an error message so you could fix it. I remember the first time I felt the sharp sting of that double standard. I was 16 and I had managed to build a website for a local bakery. I'd spent weeks teaching myself HTML and CSS, staying up until 3 in the morning. When the owner handed me a check for $150, I felt like I had conquered the world. I ran home, bursting through the front door, and found my mother in the kitchen. I waved the check in her face, breathless, expecting her to finally see me. Linda just wrinkled her nose, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Charlotte, don't be tacky," she scolded, not even looking at the amount. "Talking about money is unseemly for a young lady. Put that away before your father sees you bragging." 2 days later, Aaron won a meaningless regional trophy for a game he barely played in. My parents threw a barbecue that cost $500. They invited half the town. I sat in my room upstairs listening to the laughter and the sizzle of the grill, clutching my tacky check and realizing that in their eyes my achievements were invisible. But the real break, the moment that severed the emotional tether for good, happened my senior year. I had done the impossible. I had earned a partial scholarship to a university on the West Coast for their computer science program. It was my ticket out. It was proof that I was worth something. I laid the acceptance letter and the financial aid packet on the dining room table, the same table Mark would slam his hand on a decade later. I explained the math. The scholarship covered tuition, but I needed a co-signer for the housing loan. I had a job lined up on campus. I had a plan. Mark picked up the packet, scanned it for fewer than 10 seconds, and tossed it back down like it was junk mail. "No," he said flatly. "What do you mean, no?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's a top-tier program. It's my future." "We're not paying for you to run off to the coast and become some liberal tech zombie," he sneered, crossing his arms. "I won't have my signature on that garbage. You want an education? The community college here has a perfectly fine business program. Something practical. You can live here, save us money, and learn how to actually work." I begged. I pleaded. I told them this was my one chance to be great. They didn't budge. They insisted I stay local, stay small, stay under their thumb. I was crushed. I spent that night crying until I threw up, watching my dream dissolve because my father didn't like the geography of my success. 3 weeks later, Aaron decided he wanted a new truck. He didn't have the credit for it. Without a moment's hesitation, Mark and Linda co-signed the loan. Then they co-signed the lease for his first apartment because, as Linda put it, a young man needs his own space to grow. When I confronted them about the hypocrisy, Linda just sighed and adjusted her cross necklace. "It's different, Charlie. Aaron is staying. He's building a life here. Families help each other when they respect the family values." That was the mask they wore. The mask of respectability. In church, they were the perfect parents. They hugged Aaron in the pews, accepting praise for his service as a firefighter, while they talked about me in hushed, mournful tones to the other church ladies. "Just keep praying for Charlotte," Linda would whisper. "She's having a hard time finding her way." They turned me into a tragedy so they could play the saints. At 20 years old, after one semester of the soul-crushing business program at the community college, I snapped. I packed a single duffel bag, took my failing laptop, and dropped out. I found a cheap room in the city 3 hours away and told them I was leaving. "You're spitting on our sacrifice," Mark had yelled as I walked out the door. "You'll be back in a month. You don't know how the real world works." I vowed then, as I drove a beat-up car toward a terrifying and lonely horizon, that I would never ask them for $1. I would starve before I gave them the satisfaction of being right. I thought distance would free me. I thought if I built my life far enough away, outside their zip code and their influence, they couldn't touch it. I didn't know they would find another way, a quieter, uglier way. The first 2 years in the city were exactly what my father predicted, though not for the reasons he thought. I lived in a studio apartment that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and damp drywall, sleeping on a mattress I'd dragged off the curb. My diet consisted of instant ramen and determination. But while Mark and Linda probably imagined me partying or drifting aimlessly, I was working harder than anyone they knew. I became a ghost in my own life, disappearing into the digital ether. I taught myself full-stack development, then pivoted to direct response marketing, funnel architecture, and email automation. I wasn't just building websites anymore. I was building engines that printed money for other people. I took every freelance gig I could find. I fixed broken Shopify stores at 300 a.m. I rewrote ad copy for desperate dropshippers. I was grinding, learning the anatomy of a sale, the psychology of the click. Small wins started to pile up. I helped a local bakery triple their online orders during the holiday rush. I saved a failing subscription box company from bankruptcy by overhauling their retention sequence. I was good at this. I was terrifyingly good at this. But the real turning point came when I stumbled upon a struggling American-made outdoor gear brand. They had incredible products, heirloom-quality jackets and tents, but their online presence was a tragedy. They were bleeding cash on the verge of folding. I pitched the owner, a gruff old man, who reminded me of my father, but with the capacity to listen. I didn't ask for a high hourly rate. I asked for a modest retainer, a percentage of revenue growth, and a small slice of equity if we hit certain milestones. He laughed, thinking he was getting cheap labor. 18 months later, nobody was laughing. I rebuilt their entire digital ecosystem. We scaled that company from 6 figures to 8. When my payout for that fiscal year hit my business account, I stared at the screen for a full hour. It was 7 digits, 1 comma, 2 commas. I sat on the floor of my slightly nicer but still modest apartment and cried. I didn't cry because I could buy a Porsche. I cried because I was safe. I cried because every dollar was a brick in a wall that kept me away from the Boise County humiliation. By 27, I wasn't just a freelancer. I was an institution. I incorporated Rivers' digital frameworks, hiring a team of brilliant remote developers and copywriters. We built a proprietary tech tool for automated customer retention that became an industry secret weapon. My personal income cleared $5 million that year. I bought a luxury apartment in the city cash. I started quietly acquiring rental properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods. I maxed out retirement accounts I hadn't even told my parents existed. I was rich. Not comfortable, not doing well, but wealthy in a way my family couldn't even comprehend. And I told them absolutely nothing. The silence wasn't accidental, it was a survival strategy. I knew Mark and Linda. If they smelled money, the dynamic would shift instantly. They wouldn't see my success as proof of my competence. They would see it as a resource to be managed. They would try to control it, tithe it, or guilt me into funding Aaron's latest hobby. But the second reason for my silence was more painful. They never asked. I called home once a month, dutifully checking the box. The conversations were always the same. "When are you getting a real job, Charlotte?" my mother would ask, her voice tight with disapproval. "Mrs. Gable's son just got hired at the insurance firm. Good benefits. A 401k. I would try to explain that I ran a company, that I managed staff, but they would talk over me. "Aaron just got a commendation for saving a kid from a car wreck," my father would boom from the background. "That's real work. That's service. What are you doing again? Playing on the computer?" So I stopped trying. I let them believe I was scraping by. It was easier to be the disappointment they expected than to fight for the respect they withheld. But while I was building a quiet empire, the town was building a myth. My cousin, the only relative who treated me like a human being, started sending me screenshots. They were nauseating. My mother was posting on Facebook soliciting prayers for her lost daughter. One post read, "Please pray for Charlie. She's struggling out there alone, bouncing between online gigs. It's hard to watch your children lose their way, but we trust the Lord will humble her." The comments were a chorus of sympathy for the saintly parents dealing with the prodigal daughter. Even worse were the reports from the town barbecues. Aaron was telling people I was involved in some MLM pyramid thing, making jokes about me selling essential oils or leggings to pay rent. They had turned my silence into failure. They needed me to be failing. If I was failing, then their small indebted lives were vindicated. If I was succeeding, it meant their entire worldview, that obedience to them was the only path to happiness, was a lie. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. While they painted me as a destitute drifter, I was anonymously funding 5 full-ride scholarships at the local community college, the same one I had dropped out of. I specifically designated the funds for students studying technology and design. I was pouring money back into their community, into their neighbors' kids, and they were spitting on my name. The disconnect between my reality and their fiction came crashing down late one night a week before that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. I was sitting on my balcony overlooking the city skyline wrapped in a cashmere throw that cost more than my mother's wedding ring when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my cousin. "Hey, did you really get kicked out of your place and start couch surfing? Your mom was crying at church today telling people things are really bad for you and that they might have to intervene." I stared at the glowing screen, the city lights blurring in the background. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just that they misunderstood me. It wasn't just that they didn't care to know the truth. They were actively rewriting me. They were crafting a narrative of destitution so detailed, so convincing, that they probably believed it themselves. I didn't reply. I just set the phone down on the glass table. That was the moment I realized that to my parents, I wasn't a person. I was a prop in the tragedy of their own making. They were telling the world I was a beggar while I was sitting on a throne they couldn't see. I thought their lies were just sad, pathetic attempts to garner sympathy. I didn't know then that the lies were necessary. They needed me to be desperate because if I was desperate, I wouldn't look too closely at what they were doing in the dark. The email that dismantled my life arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried between a calendar invite for a client strategy session and a receipt for a software subscription. The subject line was innocuous enough to be terrifying. Action required, guarantor confirmation, Rivers Home Expansion Loan. I almost deleted it. Phishing scams are a dime a dozen in my industry, and I didn't have any loans with the frantic urgency usually implied by such headers. But something made me pause. The sender wasn't a generic customer service bot. It was a specific person at a regional bank in Idaho, the kind of institution my parents had banked with since the 80s. I clicked it open. "Dear Ms. Rivers, we require your updated signature for the annual compliance review on the loan term ending November 30th. As the primary guarantor on the $420,000 secured note, your prompt attention is appreciated." The coffee in my stomach turned to acid. $420,000. I stared at the number, waiting for it to change, for the pixels to rearrange themselves into a mistake. I didn't have a loan with that bank. I didn't have a home expansion project. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number in the signature block, bypassing the customer service line. A cheerful woman named Brenda answered on the second ring. "Oh, hello, Charlotte. So good to finally speak with you. Your father speaks so highly of you." "Who is this?" I asked, my voice tight. "I received an email about a loan. I think there's been a mistake." "A mistake?" Brenda laughed lightly. "Oh no, honey. It's just the standard 2-year review. For the remodel on the house and the commercial line of credit. I never signed for a loan." I said, the room starting to spin. "Send me the documents. Now." The cheerfulness evaporated from Brenda's voice, replaced by a confused professional coldness. Well, I can email you the copies on file. One moment." 3 minutes later, a PDF landed in my inbox. I opened it, and my world tilted on its axis. There on the bottom of page 32 was my name, Charlotte Ann Rivers, and next to it was a signature. It was a good attempt looping the C the way I used to in high school, but it wasn't mine. The ink was too heavy, the slant slightly off. It was a forgery. A clumsy, desperate forgery. I scrolled up to the applicant details. My social security number was there, correct to the last digit. My old address. And under employment, it didn't list Rivers Digital Frameworks or my real income. It read, freelance consultant, income variable low. They had used my creditworthiness, my perfect score that I had guarded like a hawk, but listed me as having limited income so they could frame it as a family-backed asset loan. But the real knife in the gut came when I looked at the disbursement breakdown. The loan wasn't just for a kitchen remodel or a new roof. Buried in the itemized list was a wire transfer for $120,000 to an entity called Rivers Wellness and Training Center. I froze. Rivers Wellness was Aaron's pipe dream. For years, he'd talked about opening a boutique gym for first responders, a place where heroes could lift weights and high-five each other. I thought it was just talk. But looking at this document, I realized it was real. He had built his dream gym, and he had built it using my financial identity as the foundation. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone. I went perfectly icily still. I took a screenshot of the signature page and the disbursement to Aaron's LLC. I opened a text thread with my mother. Care to explain why my name is on a $500,000 loan I never signed? I hit send. The response came 3 minutes later. No apology, no panic, just gaslighting. Don't overreact, Charlotte, Linda wrote. We knew you'd be fine with it. You make some money online, but you don't have expenses like real families do. This was for the family, for Aaron's future, for the house, for all of us. We didn't want to bother you with the paperwork since you're always so busy. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Mark. You're being dramatic. Families help each other. You should be proud your name is finally useful for something other than staring at a screen. We're paying it. Stop making a scene. I sat back in my ergonomic office chair surrounded by the legitimate success I had built with blood and sweat, and felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just them borrowing money. This was felony identity theft. This was bank fraud. They had walked into a bank, looked a loan officer in the eye, and impersonated me, or at least claimed to have my consent to fund Aaron's vanity project and renovate a house I was kicked out of. Then my cousin's words from a few weeks ago came rushing back. The prayer requests, the rumors. It all clicked into a sickening picture. Linda wasn't just telling people I was struggling to garner sympathy. She was planting a defensive narrative. If the loan ever went bad, if the bank ever came calling, they had already seeded the community with the idea that I was the unstable one. They could claim they were managing my finances, that they had stepped in to save my credit, when in reality, they were cannibalizing it to save theirs. This threatened everything, threatened. If this loan defaulted, and knowing my father's business acumen, it wouldn't just be a ding on my credit report. A judgment of this size could trigger clauses in my own business mortgages. It could flag me during background checks for the government contracts my agency was bidding on. They weren't just stealing my past, they were putting a landmine in my future. I looked at the text message from my father again. You should be proud your name is finally useful. That was it. That was the truth, stripped of all the Thanksgiving decorations and church hymns. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't even a human being with rights. I was a resource. I was a vein of gold they had discovered in the backyard, something to be mined until it was empty, then discarded. They thought they could use me because they assumed I was weak. They assumed that the daughter who cried when she was told to leave, who ran away to the city, was still the same scared little girl. They thought I was a problem to manage. They were about to find out what happens when the problem hires a lawyer. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I simply picked up the phone and dialed a number that cost $700 an hour. By the following morning, I had a team. My lead attorney, a shark named Eleanor, who specialized in financial fraud, and a forensic accountant who could find a missing penny in a government budget. We didn't send a cease and desist. We went quiet. We filed fraud affidavits with the bank, froze the loan pending investigation, and started the tedious, ugly work of untangling the knot my parents had tied around my neck. The report the forensic accountant delivered 3 days later was a dossier of incompetence. It was worse than I thought. My father's construction business was a hollow shell rotting from the inside out due to mismanagement and underbidding. But the real black hole was Aaron's Rivers Wellness and Training Center. It was bleeding money. He had leased top-of-the-line equipment he couldn't afford and hired friends as consultants who did nothing. To keep the lights on, they hadn't just forged my name on the bank loan. They had been using my identity as a silent investor to secure vendor contracts for months. I stared at the invoices: protein powder, branded towels, industrial cleaners, all signed with that same shaky looped C. We have enough for a criminal indictment right now, Eleanor told me, tapping the file. Federal charges, Wire fraud. Identity theft. Just say the word. Not yet, I said, staring at the numbers. I don't just want them charged, I want to own the damage. I locked down my life. I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, set up 2-factor authentication on everything down to my library card, and routed all my mail to a secure P.O. box. I went completely dark on my family. When Linda texted asking why I hadn't replied to her guilt trip, I didn't answer. I let them sweat. Then the inevitable happened. With the bank loan frozen due to my fraud affidavit, the liquidity dried up. The loan went into default. My father's house, the collateral, and Aaron's gym lease were bundled into a distressed asset portfolio. Because of my existing real estate holdings and my standing as a high-net-worth investor in the region, my broker flagged the sale. He called me on a Thursday. "It's a package deal, Charlie," he said. "Commercial equipment, the lease on the gym space, the warehouse for the construction firm, and a residential property. The bank just wants it off their books." "I'll take it," I said. "All of it, through the LLC, and I want strict anonymity until the ink is dry." I wired the funds that afternoon. It was a surreal, intoxicating feeling. With a few clicks of a mouse, I became the owner of the roof over my parents' heads. I owned the warehouse where my father stored his tools. I owned the gym where Aaron played hero. They were living in a house of cards, and I had just bought the table. But they didn't know that yet. They needed to understand exactly who they were dealing with first. The opportunity for the reveal was perfect. The Hope for Tomorrow Foundation, a nonprofit helping homeless youth that I had anonymously funded for years, was hosting its annual gala in Boise. It was the social event of the season. My parents and Aaron were attending. Of course, my mother loved to put on her best dress and rub elbows with the mayor, pretending to be the charitable matriarch of a successful family. I decided to attend. And I decided to stop being anonymous. I arrived late wearing a gown that cost more than Aaron's truck. I slipped into the back of the ballroom just as the speeches were starting. The room was bathed in soft purple light, filled with the clinking of crystal and the murmur of the town's elite. I saw them near the front, Mark in his ill-fitting tuxedo, Linda beaming at a local councilman, Aaron looking bored and arrogant. They looked so comfortable in their lie. The host, a woman I had worked with closely for years, took the podium. "Tonight is special," she announced, her voice echoing through the hall. "For years, our largest donor has remained in the shadows. A young entrepreneur who built a technology empire from scratch, clearing over $5 million a year in personal income, all while quietly lifting up those who had nowhere else to go. Tonight, she has agreed to step into the light. Please welcome the founder of Rivers Digital Frameworks, Charlotte Rivers." The spotlight swung across the room and hit me. The silence that followed was absolute. I walked toward the stage, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. I kept my eyes locked forward, but in my peripheral vision I saw them. Mark's jaw had actually dropped. Linda grabbed Aaron's arm, her face draining of all color, looking like she was seeing a ghost. Aaron looked like he'd been punched in the gut. The people around them, their friends, their church group, gasped and turned to look at them, then back at me. The disconnect between the struggling lost daughter narrative and the woman walking onto the stage was violent. I took the microphone. I didn't smile. "Thank you," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "I support this fund because I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong. I know what it's like to be told your dreams are invalid, that your work isn't real, and that you should pack up and leave." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I looked directly at table 4. My father couldn't meet my eyes. "We live in a town that values family," I continued. "But sometimes the most American thing you can do is realize that you don't need your family to believe in you for your work to matter. You just need to believe in yourself enough to protect what you've built." I kept it short. I handed the microphone back and walked off stage to thunderous applause. I didn't stop at their table. I didn't stop for the well-wishers who suddenly wanted to know me. I walked straight for the exit, my heart hammering a rhythm of cold, hard victory. My phone buzzed as I reached the valet stand. It was a text from Mark. "We need to talk. Urgent. Family emergency." I looked at the screen, the notification glowing in the night air. He thought he could summon me. He thought the emergency was something I would fix rather than something I had orchestrated. I typed a reply, my fingers steady. "We will. But this time, it'll be on my terms." I chose a steakhouse downtown for the meeting, a place with white tablecloths, heavy silver, and enough ambient noise to drown out a scene if things got loud. It was neutral ground, public enough to force them to maintain their precious facade of respectability, but private enough to finally end the war they had started. I arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a sparkling water, and placed a thick manila folder on the table next to my clutch. It was the only weapon I needed. They arrived precisely on time, which was a first. Usually, they made a point of being late to let me know my time wasn't valuable. Tonight, however, the dynamic had shifted. Mark, Linda, and Aaron walked in with plastered-on smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They looked like predators trying to mimic the behavior of house pets. My mother reached for me as if to hug me, but I remained seated, offering a polite, distant nod. She froze, then awkwardly patted my shoulder before taking her seat. "Charlotte?" Mark said, his voice dripping with a sugary warmth that made my skin crawl. "We were just saying on the drive over that speech you gave. Incredible. We had no idea you were doing so well. We've always known you were special, haven't we, Linda?" "Always," Linda chimed in, clutching her napkin. "We're just so proud, and we're so glad you called. We need to clear the air. Families shouldn't keep secrets." I watched them order drinks, listening to the hollow pleasantries. They were terrified, but more than that, they were calculating. They had seen the numbers at the gala. They knew I was the liquidity they desperately needed. Once the waiter retreated, the pleasantries evaporated. Mark leaned in, adopting a conspiratorial tone. "Look, Charlie, about that text. We're in a bit of a bind. The economy has been brutal on the construction business, and Aaron's gym, well, startups are hard. The bank is being unreasonable about that loan. It was a simple mix-up with the paperwork. We were hoping, since you have the resources now, maybe you could speak to them, smooth it over, invest in the family legacy." Aaron nodded eagerly, looking like a chastised puppy. "I just need a little runway, Char. If you could just back the loan officially, I can turn it around. I didn't want to ask you before because, well, I didn't want you to feel pressured." The audacity was breathtaking. They were rewriting history in real time, framing their felony fraud as a mix-up and their exclusion of me as protecting me. I didn't say a word. I simply slid the manila folder across the pristine tablecloth. It stopped in front of my father. "Open it," I said. Mark hesitated, then flipped the cover. The first page was a photocopy of the loan application with the forged signature highlighted in neon yellow. The second was a default notice. The third was a transfer of assets document. "I didn't speak to the bank to smooth it over," I said calmly, watching the color drain from his face. "I spoke to my forensic accountant, and then I spoke to my lawyer." "What is this?" Mark whispered, his hand shaking as he turned a page. "That is the paper trail of how you stole my identity." I explained, my voice low and steady. "But keep reading. The last few pages are the most interesting." He flipped to the back. I saw the moment the realization hit him. His eyes widened and he stopped breathing. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You bought it. The bank bundled your bad debt into a distressed asset sale," I said. "I bought the note. I own the construction equipment. I own the lease on Aaron's gym. And I own the house." Linda let out a strangled gasp. "You own our house." "Technically, the LLC owns it," I corrected. "But I own the LLC. You aren't in debt to the bank anymore, Dad. You're in debt to me." "How could you?" Aaron snapped, the mask slipping. "You went behind our backs. You're trying to humiliate us. I knew it. You've always been jealous. You're just proving we were right about you. You only care about money." I care about people not stealing my future and calling it family, I countered, my voice sharpening. You told the town I was couch surfing. You told me to go live in the streets. Instead, I bought the streets you're standing on. I reached into the folder and pulled out 2 stapled packets, laying them side by side. This ends tonight, I said. You have 2 options. Option 1. You sign over all rights to the properties and the businesses to my company immediately. In exchange, I give you a lump sum cash settlement enough to rent a decent place for a year and start over. You walk away. No jail, no charges, but you have absolutely no say in my life or my assets ever again. I tapped the second packet. Option 2. You lease the house and the gym from my company at fair market value for 6 months. You pay rent to me. After 6 months, the lease terminates and you vacate. If you miss a single payment, eviction is immediate. I paused, then placed a single sheet of paper between the 2 packets. But regardless of which option you choose, you will sign this declaration. It admits that you used my identity without my consent. If you sign it, I agree not to pursue criminal charges. If you don't sign it, my lawyer files it with the FBI tomorrow morning. Linda began to hyperventilate. You're destroying this family, Charlotte. How can you be so cruel? We raised you. You didn't raise me, I said, feeling a strange, cold grief wash over me. You managed me until I stopped being useful, and then you robbed me. Mark stared at the papers. He looked from the lump sum settlement to the lease agreement. I saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. He wasn't looking at me as his daughter. He was looking at the best deal he could cut. I stood up. I didn't want to watch them sign. I didn't want to hear the excuses. You are not my responsibility, I said, looking down at them one last time. Choosing me as your collateral was the last decision you got to make about my life. My attorney is waiting in the lobby to notarize your signatures. I turned and walked out. I didn't look back at the table. I walked through the restaurant, out the heavy double doors, and into the cool, biting air of the night. My heart was pounding, a mixture of adrenaline and a deep, hollowing sorrow. It was over. I had won, but it felt like a funeral. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the stars, waiting. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a text from my attorney. They've already signed option 1. I stared at the screen, a tear finally escaping and tracking hot down my cold cheek. They didn't fight for the house. They didn't fight for 6 more months together. They took the cash. They chose the money over even the pretense of a relationship. I wiped my face and unlocked my car. They had sold me out for a loan, and now they had sold me out for a settlement. But at least this time I had the receipt. It has been 8 months since I left my parents in that steakhouse with a check in their hands and a bridge burning behind them. In a small town like ours, silence is a luxury that usually costs a fortune, but I've found it's worth every penny. The gossip that once swirled around me like a tornado has finally dissipated into a vague, harmless mist. People know something happened between the Rivers family and their daughter, but without Linda to spin the narrative and Mark to enforce it, the rumors lost their teeth. The truth, it turns out, is boring to people who thrive on drama. I grew up, they sold out, and life moved on. Consequences, however, have been far more tangible. Mark and Linda moved into a small beige duplex on the edge of town, the kind of place my father used to sneer at when he drove past in his truck. There is no more Rivers construction. The equipment belongs to me, and the reputation belongs to the past. Aaron didn't bounce back either. Without the capital to prop up his vanity project, he took a job as a floor trainer at a chain gym 3 towns over. He punches a clock now, wearing a name tag that doesn't say owner. Paige left him about 3 weeks after the money dried up, which surprised absolutely no one except Aaron. My life, by contrast, has expanded in ways I never dared to imagine when I was huddled in that studio apartment eating ramen. Rivers Digital Frameworks is thriving, but I've stopped working 18-hour days. I hired a director of operations so I could step back and focus on the things that actually matter. The most satisfying project hasn't been a tech build, though. It was the renovation of the old construction warehouse. I didn't sell it. I gutted it, painted over the drab industrial gray with bright welcoming colors and subdivided the space. It's now a small business incubator. The bay where my father used to park his truck and complain about foreigners taking jobs is now home to a thriving bakery run by a Latino family who make the best pan dulce in the state. The front office is leased to a young woman who started an eco-friendly hair salon. The back lot is run by a veteran mechanic who needed a break to get his own shop started. Every time I drive past and see the parking lot full, I feel a quiet, vicious pride. I didn't just take my father's business, I replaced it with the very community he despised. This Thanksgiving was different. There were no flags on the wall, no performances of piety, and definitely no tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I hosted Friendsgiving in my apartment in the city. The table was mismatched, pulled together from my dining set, and a folding table borrowed from a neighbor, but it was full. My team members flew in, my cousin Sarah, who had been my spy, and my support. Through the worst of it, sat at my right hand, and the director of the nonprofit I supported sat across from us. Even Mr. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, who once left soup at my door when I was sick and grinding through a deadline, was there, telling stories that actually made people laugh. As we were passing the potatoes, Sarah leaned over and touched my arm. "Do you miss them?" she asked quietly, under the din of conversation. "Even a little." I looked around the room at the faces of the people who knew the real me, not the bank account, not the scapegoat, but me. I thought about the silence of my phone, the absence of guilt trips and passive-aggressive texts. I miss the idea of them, I admitted, swirling the wine in my glass. I miss the idea of the family that has your back, but I don't miss the people who used me to pay for their costumes. I realized then that I had redefined the word. Family isn't about blood, it's about the people who help you stop bleeding. A few weeks later, I had one final loose thread to cut. I had to drive back to Boise County to sign some final deed transfers for the incubator. On my way out of town, I turned down the familiar street where I had grown up. I pulled my car to the curb across from the house. It looked different. The shutters were painted a cheerful blue. There were toys scattered on the lawn, a tricycle, a plastic slide. A dog was barking happily behind the fence. As I watched, a young couple came out onto the porch chasing a toddler who was giggling uncontrollably. The house didn't look looming or judgmental anymore. It was just wood, brick, and siding. It was unhaunted. The toxicity hadn't been in the walls. It had been in the people who occupied them. Now that they were gone, the house was free. And so was I. I drove straight from the old neighborhood to my lawyer's office. I had one last document to sign. It wasn't a lawsuit or a settlement. It was the charter for a new scholarship program I was endowing at the university I had wanted to attend all those years ago. We named it the Second Chance Fund. The criteria were specific. It was for high-achieving students who had been financially cut off or disowned by their families for choosing non-traditional career paths or lifestyles. I didn't put my last name on it. I didn't want the credit. I just wanted to make sure that the next time a kid was told they were worthless for dreaming big, they would have a lifeline I never had. That night back in the city, I drove up to the overlook where I used to park when I first ran away from home. I leaned against the railing, looking out at the grid of lights stretching to the horizon. The wind was cold, but it felt clean. I remembered the way my father's voice had echoed in the dining room telling me to go live in the truck stop, to go be a stray. He had wanted me to be homeless so I would come crawling back to the only home he thought mattered. He was wrong. I wasn't a stray. I was a builder. My parents told me to go live in the streets. So I did the most American thing I could think of. I built my own road and made sure no one else would ever be thrown out of it the way I was. With the creation of the Second Chance Fund, Charlie Rivers officially closed the most painful chapter of her life, reclaiming her name with quiet dignity. If you were in Charlie's position, what would you have done? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of betrayal and ultimate vindication. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.